The lap time was 195.994 miles per hour. Not at Talladega, not at Daytona. This was Ontario Motor Speedway, spring of 1981. And the number belonged to a car with a 3.8-liter turbocharged Buick 5.6 under the hood instead of the V8 that everyone else was running. The car was entered by Rod Osterland, driven by Herschel McGriff. And it was, for a few months in 1981, the most technologically threatening object in American stock car racing. Fast enough that Bill France Jr. felt compelled to act mid-season with an urgency NASCAR almost never brought to technical matters. This is not a simple story of a rebel technology getting slapped down by the establishment. It's something stranger. How a six-cylinder engine built for fuel economy became, briefly and spectacularly, the fastest thing on the Winston Cup superspeedways. To understand why the Turbo V6 existed in NASCAR in 1981, you have to understand the peculiar position that American motorsport occupied in the years immediately following the oil shocks of the 1970s. The first embargo hit in 1973, the second in 1979, and in between those two convulsions, the American automobile industry underwent a transformation so complete and so reluctant that it barely resembled its former self. Engine displacement fell, compression ratios dropped. The muscle car era, which had crested somewhere around 1969 and 1970 with 454 cubic inch big blocks and 446 packs, was not just over. It was actively being dismantled by corporate mandate and government regulation, replaced by the smaller, lighter, more frugal power plants that Washington and the consumer market were demanding simultaneously. General Motors, which had spent the better part of 2 decades making large engines larger, found itself in the strange position of needing to make its cars dramatically more fuel efficient without destroying the performance identity that had defined its brands. The solution the company kept returning to was turbocharging. A turbocharged, small displacement engine could, in theory, deliver the power of a larger engine when the driver needed performance while sipping fuel at the frugal rate of a compact when the driver wanted efficiency. Buick had been the division most committed to this idea. The Buick 3.8-liter V6, an engine with a lineage stretching back to the odd-fire unit that had powered unglamorous Buick Skylarks in the 1960s, had been turbocharged and installed in the 1978 Buick Century, the first turbocharged American production car since the Oldsmobile Jetfire of 1962. By 1981, the turbocharged 3.8 was available in the Buick Regal, and it was generating performance numbers that, on paper, suggested possibilities that the NASCAR garage was just beginning to think through seriously. NASCAR, in this period, had a complicated relationship with its own rules regarding engine displacement and configuration. The Winston Cup series ran under a set of technical regulations that had evolved organically over 3 decades, designed primarily to govern the large displacement naturally aspirated V8s that had always been the basis of American stock car racing. The rules specified minimum weight, maximum displacement for naturally aspirated V8 engines, wheelbase requirements, body template conformity, fuel specifications, and dozens of other parameters. But they had never needed to address turbocharging in any serious way, because nobody had brought a turbocharged car to Winston Cup competition in the modern era with any genuine intention of winning. The rules were, in this specific technical domain, essentially silent. And silence in racing regulations is always an invitation. The men who brought the turbocharged Oldsmobile to NASCAR in 1981 were not primarily ideological disruptors. They were racers who had looked at the regulations with the particular reading comprehension that competitive people develop when large sums of money and the possibility of victory are at stake. And they had noticed the silence. If NASCAR didn't specifically prohibit turbocharging. And if a turbocharged car could be made to pass the basic inspection requirements for body conformity and minimum weight, then a turbocharged car was, technically and legally, a NASCAR car. The question was whether it would be fast. The answer, it turned out, was yes, almost embarrassingly so. The engine at the center of this story was the Buick 3.8-liter V6 in turbocharged form. But, to call it simply, the production Buick turbo engine is to miss the extent to which it had been developed and refined by the time it reached Winston Cup competition. What was installed in the Oldsmobile body that Osterland's team ran in 1981 bore a family resemblance to what you could order at your local Buick dealer, but it had been worked over by people who understood the difference between a street engine and a race engine, with the precision that separates real engineering from enthusiastic tinkering. The fundamental principle of turbocharging is straightforward enough to explain in a single sentence. Exhaust gases spin a turbine. The turbine drives a compressor. The compressor forces more air into the engine. More air means more fuel can be burned. More fuel burned means more power. But the engineering required to make it work reliably at sustained high loads on a racing circuit is anything but simple. The turbocharger used on the competition Buick 5.6 was a Garrett unit, selected for its ability to generate boost pressure in the range of 14 to 16 pounds per square inch, which was enough to transform a 231 cubic inch engine that made roughly 165 horsepower in street trim into something that, when fully optimized for competition, was generating power figures that made the naturally aspirated V8 teams extremely uncomfortable. The specific power output of the competition Turbo 5.6 was never publicly confirmed by the team with precision, which was itself a form of strategic communication. You don't advertise numbers that might cause regulators to pay closer attention. But the performance data generated during qualifying and race conditions told their own story. A naturally aspirated 358 cubic inch V8 running on the superspeedways of the early 1980s was producing somewhere in the range of 450 to 500 horsepower at maximum race trim, depending on the quality of the engine builder and the specific configuration being used. The turbocharged V6 running at full boost was generating power in a range that many observers estimated at 550 to 600 horsepower. Not from 358 cubic inches and 8 cylinders, but from 231 cubic inches and 6. The weight differential was the other part of the equation that made the turbo car interesting. NASCAR's minimum weight rules specified the total weight of the car, but within that total, the distribution could vary. A V6 engine, even with the turbocharger and its associated plumbing, was significantly lighter than a V8. That difference in mass could be redistributed within the chassis, moved lower, moved rearward, moved to optimize the weight distribution for handling, in ways that gave the turbo car a chassis setup flexibility that V8 teams simply didn't have access to. You were getting more power and better chassis balance simultaneously, and you were doing it while running an engine that was technically derived from a production passenger car, which meant the team could point to the Buick Regal in the showroom as justification for their presence under the regulations requiring stock-based machinery. The aerodynamic story added another layer. The Oldsmobile body ran on the GM platform that NASCAR accepted for competition, but the reduced frontal area requirements of the engine bay, smaller engine, simpler packaging, allowed for hoodline choices and air intake configurations that differed from what the V8 teams were running. None of this was illegal, but all of it contributed to a package that was, when all the variables were assembled correctly, faster than the competition on the long high-bank tracks where top speed was the primary determinant of performance. What made the situation genuinely dangerous from NASCAR's institutional perspective was not merely that the turbo car was fast. Fast cars appeared in NASCAR regularly. What made it dangerous was that its fastness was not susceptible to the traditional responses available to the sanctioning body. When a particular carburetor jet was producing too much power, you restricted it. When a particular engine configuration was generating too many cubic inches, you measured it. When a particular chassis modification was providing unfair advantage, you banned the modification. But the Turbo V6 was fast for reasons that were distributed across the entire concept of forced induction. Reasons that couldn't be addressed by measuring a single component or restricting a single variable without effectively banning the entire technology. And banning the entire technology mid-season, after teams had invested in developing it, was a decision that required a level of institutional will that NASCAR didn't usually like to exercise, because it set precedents and invited legal challenges and made enemies. The 1981 Winston Cup season opened with the Daytona 500, as it always did. And at Daytona, the Turbo Oldsmobile was fast enough to cause attention, but not fast enough to win outright. The car had development issues. Turbocharging, unlike natural aspiration, introduces lag, heat management challenges, and reliability variables that take time to engineer out of a racing application. And the team was still learning how to extract the full potential of the package under race conditions that differed significantly from dyno testing or limited track sessions. But the qualifying times were noted. The people who paid attention to qualifying times for a living, chief among them Bill France Jr. and his technical director, Lynn Kutchler, noticed them in a way that translated, in the weeks following Daytona, into quiet conversations about what the regulations did and didn't say about this particular form of power production. The conversations remained quiet through the early part of the season because the turbo car's race performance, while promising, hadn't yet translated into the kind of crushing superspeedway dominance that would force an immediate response. Reliability issues, driver adjustment to the turbo's power delivery characteristics, and the ongoing development work required to optimize the cooling and boost control systems meant that the car was finishing races at a competitive pace without quite winning them. NASCAR can absorb a fast car that doesn't win. It can tolerate a fast car that finishes 5th or 6th consistently. What it cannot comfortably absorb, what creates the institutional pressure that forces regulatory responses, is a fast car that starts winning, because winning changes the conversation from technical speculation to established fact. The qualifying sessions were a different matter. Qualifying happened in isolated bursts of maximum effort, without the thermal management demands of a 200-mile race, without the tire conservation strategies, without the fuel mileage calculations, just the driver and the car and the track. 1 or 2 laps at maximum attack. In qualifying, the Turbo V6's advantages were on fullest display, because the conditions that stressed its reliability most, sustained high-load operation over extended periods, were absent. What remained was the raw performance number, the elapsed time, the trap speed, and these were becoming increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence or optimal setup. At Talladega in the summer, the situation reached a level of urgency that the previous month's worth of quietly getting faster had been building toward. Talladega Superspeedway, with its 2.66-mile layout and banking that allowed cars to carry extraordinary corner speeds, was the venue where aerodynamic and power advantages expressed themselves most completely. The Turbo Oldsmobile at Talladega went around the track at speeds that were not marginally faster than the best V8 competitors. They were demonstrably, quantifiably, significantly faster. The qualifying performance produced lap times that sat outside the range of what the V8 field could match. And the gap was not the kind of gap that could be closed by engine-building talent or setup optimization. It was the kind of gap that could only be closed by a fundamental change in the technology being used. The V8 teams reacted the way V8 teams always react when confronted with evidence that they are being beaten, not by better execution of the same approach, but by a categorically different approach. They complained, vocally and collectively, to NASCAR. Their argument was not primarily technical, though they dressed it in technical language. It was fundamentally an argument about competitive equity, about the fact that they had built their operations, their engine programs, their supplier relationships, and their technical development budgets around the assumption that they were competing against naturally aspirated V8 engines, and that introducing a fundamentally different propulsion technology mid-season, without warning, without a transition period, without any regulatory framework governing how its performance should be controlled, was unfair to them and harmful to the series. This argument had weight, not because it was technically precise. NASCAR's rules had always rewarded ingenuity in finding advantages within their imprecise boundaries, but because it was economically and institutionally true. The V8 manufacturers, particularly Chevrolet, Ford, and Pontiac, had substantial financial and promotional investments in NASCAR. Those investments were premised on their engines winning races. Bill France Jr. did not move quickly, but he moved decisively when he moved. The turbocharger ban that NASCAR imposed during the 1981 season, effective at a specific point in the calendar that the organization's internal deliberations had determined, was the earliest feasible date given the notice requirements implied by basic competitive fairness, was not framed as a permanent prohibition on innovation. It was framed with the careful language that regulatory bodies use when they're making decisions that might be reviewed by lawyers as a clarification of existing rules. The rules had always required that engines be based on production configurations available to the general public, the argument went. The rules had always been intended to govern naturally aspirated V8 engines. The turbocharger, while not explicitly prohibited, was not consistent with the intent of the regulations, and intent, when regulations were ambiguous, governed. This was, legally speaking, a defensible but not airtight position. The regulations did not explicitly require natural aspiration. They did not explicitly prohibit turbocharging. The team had been running the car with NASCAR's knowledge since the beginning of the season, had passed technical inspections, had qualified legitimately for every event it entered. Banning the technology mid-season, after the team had invested in its development, was an act that exposed NASCAR to the accusation that it had moved the goalposts, not because the rules had been violated, but because the car was winning, or at minimum threatening to win, and winning with a technology that the establishment V8 competitors couldn't immediately replicate. The team did not mount a significant legal challenge, which was partly a function of resources. The fighting NASCAR in court was expensive and rarely productive for the challenger, and partly a function of the political reality that a team operating in a series owned and governed by a private entity ultimately had to accept the governing entity's decisions or leave the series. The turbocharged Oldsmobile was withdrawn. The experiment was over. The rules were subsequently amended with language that was explicit where they had previously been silent, specifying natural aspiration as a requirement for competition engines in ways that would prevent any future iteration of the turbo argument from getting the traction that the 1981 car had managed. What NASCAR did not do, and what would have been politically impossible given the relationships involved, was acknowledge in any formal way that the turbo car had been faster than the V8 field by a margin that went beyond the range of normal competitive variation. The official position was, and remained, that the technology had been addressed for reasons of competitive balance and regulatory consistency, not because it had proven unbeatable. Whether that characterization was accurate is a question that the performance data from Talladega and Ontario effectively answers for anyone willing to read it straight. The turbocharged Oldsmobile episode has to be understood in the context of a series that was, in 1981, actively negotiating its identity in relation to the automobile industry that nominally sponsored it. The manufacturer relationships that defined NASCAR's economics, the factory backing, the promotional money, the engine development support, were built on a specific promise: that winning in NASCAR meant something about the production cars that the manufacturers were trying to sell to American consumers. If a Chevrolet won at Daytona, it was good for Chevrolet's showroom sales. Not because the Daytona-winning Chevrolet bore any serious mechanical resemblance to the Malibu sitting in the dealer lot, but because the association between winning and the brand carried a promotional value that justified the investment. This formula worked as long as what was winning was recognizably a V8-powered American automobile in the tradition that consumers associated with Chevrolet or Ford or Pontiac. A turbocharged Buick Phi 6-powered Oldsmobile won nothing in the tradition. It won, or threatened to win, in a way that was technically consistent with the letter of the rules, but deeply inconsistent with the promotional narrative that the series existed to generate. You couldn't run an advertisement showing the Turbo Oldsmobile crossing the finish line at Talladega and then cut to a Buick Century with the tagline, "As proven in NASCAR competition," without raising questions that the industry's marketing departments weren't equipped to answer. The turbo car's speed was real, but it was speed produced by technology that GM's own internal politics were deeply ambivalent about, and that ambivalence was communicated through various informal channels to the people in Daytona Beach who made decisions about what NASCAR's cars were allowed to be. The 1981 episode also needs to be placed alongside the other technology bans that defined NASCAR's regulatory history in this period. The series had a long tradition of banning innovations that threatened competitive equilibrium. Not always immediately, not always cleanly, but consistently enough that the pattern was recognizable. The turbine-powered Lotus at Indianapolis in 1967 and 1968 had produced a parallel sequence of events in open-wheel racing. A new technology arrived, went fast, threatened to win, and was banned or restricted before it could permanently alter the competitive landscape. NASCAR's response to the Turbo V6 followed the same template, with the added dimension that the series' dependence on manufacturer relationships gave it economic incentives to respond that went beyond the purely sporting calculus of competitive balance. The political skill with which France handled the situation, acknowledging the car's presence throughout the early season without issuing an immediate ban, allowing the performance evidence to accumulate until the case for regulatory action was overwhelming, then acting with enough apparent deliberation that the decision could be presented as principled rather than reactive, was characteristic of his management style. He was not a man who liked to be seen as responding to pressure from the V8 engine manufacturers, even when he was doing exactly that. The timing and framing of the turbo ban gave him the ability to present it as a proactive regulatory decision rather than a capitulation. And in the institutional memory of NASCAR, that framing survived. Rod Osterland had built his team from a competitive but not dominant outfit into one of the more interesting operations on the Winston Cup circuit. He had given Dale Earnhardt his first Winston Cup championship in 1980, which was an achievement that bought him considerable goodwill in the garage and considerable credibility with potential technical partners. His willingness to pursue the turbocharged Oldsmobile in 1981 reflected a combination of genuine technical curiosity and competitive desperation, the kind of thinking that leads team owners to consider alternatives to the established approach when the established approach isn't producing victories at the rate that justifies the investment. Herschel McGriff, who drove the turbo car in some of its most significant outings, brought a perspective shaped by decades of competition in forms of racing where mechanical innovation was the primary path to advantage. McGriff was not, by the early 1980s, a young man chasing his first victory. He was an experienced competitor who understood the mechanics of what was under the hood with an engineer's appreciation for what worked and what didn't at high loads and sustained speeds. His assessment of the Turbo V6's potential was, by all subsequent accounts, clear-eyed and unsentimental. The engine was fast, it had reliability concerns that additional development would address, and, if given the time to mature, it would be very difficult for the naturally aspirated V8 competitors to beat. The engineers and engine builders who worked on the turbo package operated largely without public recognition, which was normal for the technical personnel who did the actual work in NASCAR teams of that era. What they had accomplished was, by any objective technical measure, impressive. Taking a passenger car engine designed for fuel efficiency, adapting it for sustained high-performance racing use, and producing a package that was demonstrably faster than the competition on the tracks where power and speed were the primary variables. The fact that the rules subsequently changed to eliminate their work from competition did not diminish the quality of what they had built. The turbocharged Oldsmobile of 1981 left several things in its wake, not all of them immediately visible. The most obvious legacy was the amendment to NASCAR's technical regulations that explicitly prohibited forced induction, language that remained in the rules for decades and that was specifically cited whenever any subsequent discussion of turbocharging arose in the context of Cup Series competition. The episode had defined a boundary that the series was committed to maintaining, not necessarily because turbocharging was inherently wrong for stock car racing, but because the experience of 1981 had made clear how quickly it could destabilize competitive equilibrium in a series whose economics depended on the V8 manufacturers staying engaged. The less obvious legacy was the precedent it set for how NASCAR would respond to technology threats going forward. The turbocharged Oldsmobile established a template: monitoring, patience, accumulation of performance evidence, then decisive action framed as regulatory clarification rather than reactive banning. This template appeared again and again in subsequent years, in the response to various aerodynamic innovations, in the management of restrictor plate technology, in the handling of the roof-mounted camera pod aerodynamics controversy, in the response to the Gen 6 car's various technical surprises. NASCAR learned in 1981 that it could act against technology that was winning without appearing to be acting against technology that was winning, as long as it moved at the right speed and with the right framing. For the broader history of turbocharged racing engines, the 1981 NASCAR episode was a footnote in a decade when turbocharging was simultaneously revolutionizing Formula One, where the 1.5-liter turbo engines of the early 1980s were producing power figures that the naturally aspirated 3-liter engines couldn't begin to match, and transforming sports car racing, where the Porsche 956 and 962 were demonstrating what modern forced induction could do at Le Mans and Daytona. The technology that NASCAR banned in 1981 was not going away. It was merely going away from NASCAR. The forces that made it attractive, fuel efficiency, power density, the ability to produce significant power from small displacement, continued to drive its development in every other form of motorsport that had the regulatory flexibility to accommodate it. The car itself exists now only in photographs and the memories of people who were in the garage in 1981 and watched it qualify at speeds that made no apparent sense for a 6-cylinder engine. The Buick 3.8 V6, in non-turbocharged form, went on to have a long career as a NASCAR competition engine in the Busch Series, later the Nationwide Series, where it powered cars for years without attracting the regulatory attention that its forced induction cousin had generated in the Cup Series. The turbocharger that had caused all the difficulty remained on the shelf, waiting for a rulebook that would never, in NASCAR's primary series, accommodate it. What the turbocharged Oldsmobile of 1981 demonstrated, finally and permanently, was that NASCAR's rules were not merely technical documents, but institutional commitments. Commitments to a particular definition of what a NASCAR race car was, what it looked like, and, most importantly, what made it go fast. The V8 engine was not just a power source. It was an identity, a tradition, a promise made to the manufacturers whose money kept the series running. The Turbo V6 had the temerity to show that the promise could be beaten, that the tradition could be outrun, and that the identity was not as fixed as everyone had assumed. For 8 months in 1981, a 6-cylinder engine from a family sedan proved it faster than anything in the Winston Cup. Then the rules changed, and nobody talked about it very much for a very long time, which is precisely what institutions do with the things that frighten them most.